right, thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for being here. Really happy to be here. I first attended Process Mining Camp 2 years ago. I was really impressed by all the talks, really cool use cases for process mining, really interesting cases, lots of data, lots of complex processes. And well, to be honest, my talk is about something completely different. Actually, to the point where I had a talk with the guys from Fluxicon where they asked me to share my case today. And I said, well, I'm cool with that, but are you sure? Because my case is kind of like a side project I did on a Sunday afternoon, really low data volumes and not a really complex process. But I like to think it's a fresh approach, a different approach to apply process mining. And that's what I want to share with you today, and I hope you'll like it. So my name is Marc Tollens. I work for the Air France KLM group. It's a group of airlines. I work for the biggest 2 airlines in the group. I'm both based in Paris. I work for Air France, and I'm based in Amsterdam, and there I work for KLM. This is me. I have a background in digital analytics and user research. I started as such at Air France KLM. Basically what I did was walk around and talk to the people who are building products and tell them who our customers are, how they're using our products, and what they think about our products. I've been doing that for a couple of years, and yeah, I guess they got a bit sick and tired of me walking around with all these insights and telling them how to do to improve their products. And they told me, well, if you know it all that well, why don't you do it yourself? So I did. And I became digital product owner at Air France KLM. So right now I'm responsible for a large part of both the Air France and KLM website. And I lead some of our development teams. Sorry about that. Next to that, I'm also a committee member at Platform Digital Analytics, which is part of the Dutch Market Research Association. Yeah, we have representatives from the Dutch government, from client side and agency side, and we discuss about topics regarding digital analytics. Enough about me, a bit about the company. So Air France KLM, we're an airline, we have airplanes, we fly people from A to B, either via Paris-Charles de Gaulle or via Amsterdam Schiphol. It's really simple. Our context is a bit more complex. So we're active in the airline industry, and it's a very, very competitive industry. So we have to choose. We have to choose a focus, and we have to give people, our customers, a reason to fly with us. And in the airline industry, you can basically distinguish yourself on 3 dimensions. It's either product leadership. So in our industry, that means that you have either the most of a certain product, which is an airplane, or the newest. So in this dimension, we are competing with so-called Gulf carriers, airlines like Emirates, Etihad, Qatar Airways. They have a lot of oil dollars, incredible fleets. So for example, to give you an idea, Emirates, they have about over 100 A380s at this point. An Airbus A380 is the biggest passenger airplane in the world. The Air France KLM group has 10, KLM has 0. So they come in, the basic model comes in at about $300 to $400 million each. So you can imagine the capital that's needed if you want to compete on that dimension. We could try, but we'll be very, very dead very, very quickly. It's a terrible idea. So we could also choose to compete on a second dimension, which is operational excellence. And this is a completely different dimension. Here we're competing with so-called low-cost carriers like Ryanair or EasyJet, who are very good at operating at very low cost levels. Well, Air France and KLM, we're very old companies, we're very big companies. I think we're one of the biggest employers in France and the Netherlands. If we would try to be like Ryanair and EasyJet, we would be in a lot of fights with the unions, even more than today. And again, we'll be very, very dead very, very quickly. Again, terrible idea. So what we did, we chose to focus on a dimension where we're already relatively good at, if we listen to our customers, which is providing a good customer experience. And providing a good customer experience is pretty damn hard. Especially for us, we're an old company, we have a lot of legacy, and we're pretty damn slow. So the way we try to provide a good experience is not to force people to go to our touch points. So basically what we're doing in a very simple way, we're bringing our airline functionality to the touch points that people are already using. So for example, we allow people to book their flights, to check in for their flights on Facebook Messenger, for example. Through APIs, we offer it on each touch point that's available and our customers are actually using already. And we're very proud of this, these kind of achievements. We think it's really cool and would like to talk about it for years. But the reality is that customers are changing quite rapidly, are changing much faster than companies are. So what's cool today is the new normal tomorrow for our customers. And customers' expectations are growing each day. And we really have to keep up if we want to be best in class on that dimension that we choose to compete on. And the thing is, our way of developing product doesn't really match this new reality. So for the ones of you who have worked in product development, you might recognize this process. This is the old school waterfall way of developing products. And 6 months is actually quite a short product for waterfall projects. Sometimes it might take 1 or 2 years. So in this rapidly changing behavior of customers, this really isn't a nice fit. So what happens here, how we used to work, was we would spend months or maybe even a year getting requirements, and then into the smallest detail already, before we start building it, we're going to describe how a certain product should work. So along with a lot of other companies, I'm assuming most of you are familiar with working Agile, as a lot of companies have made that switch over the past few years, but I'll do a kind of a short introduction. We changed to Agile, which in a very simplistic way is we try to develop products in shorter time periods. So we're not going to a whole process of describing how a product should look like in very detail. For example, a car. But if the customer need is to go from A to B, we're first going to build a skateboard. It fulfills the customer need from going to A to B. We can deliver something faster, then give it to our customers and iterate from there, learn from there. So you reduce the risk of spending a lot of time building something which doesn't really match customer needs. And we use a Scrum methodology. So we have Scrum teams, this is kind of the skeleton of a Scrum team. It can vary by industry or company. So in Scrum teams, we have a product owner, and their core business is to prioritize the work. What is most important? What do customers want most? Then we have a Scrum Master. They basically guard the process. They facilitate Scrum meetings, for example, planning sessions. We have developers who actually do the work, who build the product. And we have QA, quality assurance, or testers, who then test the product if it works as it should. And when a product team, a Scrum team, they start their work, we work in iterations of 2 weeks. They look at the backlog. So the backlog, it's being managed by the product owner. There's a whole list of work that has to be done to build a certain product. The product owner creates it, gives it to the Scrum team, and then they estimate the work. They look at each part that they need to build. So for example, building a skateboard. They look at, all right, what do we need to do? It's building the wheels, build the board, and attach it to. Then the team looks at it, they analyze it, and they estimate. They allocate a certain amount of points based on the complexity and the amount of work, for example. And then they look at all the work, and then they estimate, right, this amount of work we can finish in 2 weeks, in one sprint. Such an iteration is called. And the sum of all the points that we burn, so the work that we complete, we call velocity. And velocity is kind of important both to the team and to the business. So we expect that velocity increases as the team is continuing to work and stays together. We expect the team to get to know each other better, know each other's weaknesses, get more familiar with the product, and then in the same time frame, they can tackle more and more complex problems. And also for the company, it's important that velocity grows because we can deliver more complex stuff like integration into Facebook Messenger, for example. These are the teams. Unfortunately, we're not building skateboards. We're building web applications, so parts of the website, airfrance.com, klm.com, that help our customers go through their customer journey, make their trip a bit easier. So we have 3 teams. Yellow team, we gave them color names because we like to be flexible. If we need more work, for example, more people working on trip management, we could easily shift them around. They all have a product owner, Scrum Master, designer, tester, and then a certain amount of developers. So we have been working with these teams for about a year or so. And they're working quite a complex environment, working with quite a new technology stack. Those teams are building both the website for Air France and for KLM. And we have quite an international group of developers. We have people from Canada, Belgium, Spain, Morocco, Russia, Romania, Turkey. So that's also a cultural challenge. And to reflect on the process, so to improve the process, the team, the Scrum team, is doing a retrospective at the end of each sprint. So after the end of 2 weeks, at the end of an iteration, they look back at the work they did and look back at the process and see what went well, what went not so well. And as product owners, so kind of team leads, together with Scrum Masters, we also do a kind of retrospective after a certain amount of iterations. And during one of those retrospectives, we had a discussion about velocity, so the amount of work that the team can tackle. And it felt kind of low. We had a very talented group of developers, but the output wasn't that high. And the thing is, our project management, we do it in Jira, and the only clue they give you, if you look back at the process, is this. So this is a burn down chart. The gray line shows where you should be during the sprint, based on the story points that you planned, so the estimations of the work, and in red your actual progress. So this doesn't really help you to understand where in the process it's going wrong, how you could improve. So and at this point, if you're not informed by data, people are just going to shout whatever they think. They're going to shout their opinions, preconceptions of how the world looks, and how they think it should look. We had discussions about, well, we should ban remote working. We're quite flexible, so we let our developers work from home. So they said, well, they should all come to the office and work from 9 to 5. Or they would just say, well, I knew this person was lazy, or this team was lazy. See, our velocity is low, I was right. So I have a background as a data analyst. I've worked as a data analyst with Disco before in process mining, actually in a completely different field to analyze click paths on our website. So, and well, whenever I don't understand why something is happening, I usually go back to the data. That's kind of my nature. So I was thinking, well, we're registering all our work and our progress in Jira, our project management tool. And well, if it's stored, you probably also can get it out and analyze it. I mean, that's the whole advantage when stuff becomes digital and you don't just work with stickies. If it's digital, it's stored somewhere, it's measurable, and if it's measurable, you can improve it. So that was my suggestion during that meeting. Well, guys, it's digital, so I can get it out. Let's look at it. So at first, I got some resistance because, well, this is the core business of a Scrum Master, guarding the process and improving the process. And my core business, I'm a product owner, is just to prioritize the work. So whenever you want to do stuff and you get resistance in a corporate, you just use some magic words and you call it the proof of concept. So they said, well, Mark, you can have your fun, just do it once, and then we'll just go back to the way we always did it. So I got my way. I got my Sunday afternoon project, and this is kind of how I approached it. So I defined a scope. For this project, I scoped it to a predefined set of sprints. So we're using kind of Scrum for, it's kind of Scrum on steroids. We call it scaling Agile. It's kind of Scrum for corporates. So we work in iterations of 7 sprints, so 7 sprints of 2 weeks, 14 weeks. So I took 1 program increment, so 7 sprints. I only included items that were started and ended during those sprints. So we have like the whole flow. And I only included activities that happen after a story went into progress. So what happens when the product owner, before a team picks up a task, we have a product owner that's preparing the story, that's analyzing the request from the business or a request from a customer, and then translate it in something that's ready to be picked up by a development team. So and a lot of things happen before it actually goes into progress, and I wanted to get rid of all that trash. So I mined the activity data afterwards then from Jira, which was quite easy, clean the data, visualize the process, and then start a conversation. So I didn't just went into the data, I analyzed it and showed it to the team, so this is what it is, improve it. But actually start a conversation with the people I was working with the teams, to also get an idea of which steps in the process represented value for them, and how their process looked like, what they would wanted to get out of it, etc. So after those conversations, I showed them the process maps. So this for the first one, Team Yellow. This team was working on internet check-in. And I hope it's a bit readable. I have to look at this one, I'm sorry for that. So the steps that represent value in our process are the one on top. So when a user story goes into progress, so we take in a certain amount of stories, or task, or however you want to call it, into a sprint, so this iteration of 2 weeks. And then we take it into progress, so when a developer takes it up, when he's done coding, he puts it in review, so it's basically peer review. Another developer takes a look at it and can make some comments or say, well, this is okay, we can publish this. Then it goes to QA. So we have a tester who tests the product on different devices, different browsers, etc. And if it's okay, then we close it. So what you see here is that there are also other steps happening. So on the left, we see that after story went into progress, there were still designs added by our designer or a user experience manager. Story points were updated. So apparently after it went into progress, it was either smaller or bigger than they expected. And we had quite some, we're looking at case frequency, so we had quite an amount of stories that were moved to a next sprint. And this is kind of a problem, because that means we took something into a sprint, believing that we could finish it in 2 weeks. And we are also promising that to our stakeholders, but we couldn't. And as you can see, a lot, the volume isn't that high, but quite some stories are going from QA to being moved to a next sprint. So that's kind of where the bottleneck is. And well, I think this one is even more clear. So if you look at this picture, if you can actually read it, so you're in luck on the front rows, what do you think the main problem is here?
Which variable did you choose? The amount of work?
We're now looking at time, at average times. Yeah. So because we're working with low volumes, I'll also check with the median. So we have actually proper averages that are not too much influenced by outliers. So, sorry? Yeah, some replanning. But what kind of struck me, got my attention, was the 40 hours between QA and the closing of a story. So apparently it took the hours, the team, on average, about 18 hours to go from progress to review, to actually build a functionality, to code it. And then it took about 19 hours from review to QA, and then 40 hours to actually test the thing that we built. So it took twice the time needed to actually build functionality to test it. Well, for me, that was kind of strange. And that was also one of the reasons why it was moved to a sprint, because it just didn't fit. It was taking too long. So, and this is, maybe you think, well, you don't really need process mining for this. I mean, if you're in a retrospective at the end of the sprint, you could just see, well, things are still in QA, they're waiting to be tested, what's wrong? But the thing is, in retrospective, most of our focus is on development and how development is going and what went well or what didn't went that well. And testing is somewhat regarded as, well, the least interesting thing. You know, developers, they think they create magic and everything they create is instantly awesome, which isn't the case. And it always ends up in QA and they have to deal with that crap. So what happened here was that at the end of the sprint, so we start on a Monday and we end on a Friday in the second week. So the Friday before the ending of the sprint, all of a sudden, a lot of work was shifted to QA. So all of a sudden, on a Friday afternoon, one tester had to test all the work by the whole development team. Of course, they couldn't handle it. It was being moved to the next sprint, and then new stuff was coming in. So it wasn't really equally distributed when stuff was going to QA. And the second thing that we found was that our testers were testing, well, quite well, it was a bit too much. So they were testing on a tablet, they were testing the functionality on a mobile phone, they were testing it on a desktop, and about 10 browsers on each device. So to me that sounded like a bit of overkill. So we actually looked back, we went back to the data, how our product was being used, and we saw that 1% of our customers are actually using the product on tablet. So why not test it on tablet and take the risk? So a more data-driven and risk-based approach to testing. And I kind of dumbed it down also, the process maps. I think most people here in the room, they're used to working with data. And we like to do sophisticated data analysis and make sophisticated visualizations of the data. And sometimes we forget that it's really hard for people who are not used to working with data to really grasp what is going on. And sometimes you have to really make it simple to drill it down to one figure or just one smiley, for example. It's going well, it's not going well. So this is basically what I gave the team. So 77% of the stories are being completed in a time frame that actually fits a sprint. So in terms of working hours, 62% of the stories were not completed in a sprint. And well, it took 40 hours to QA the work. So that's what I gave them. And then together with them, put it in context. Because I was looking at it, but it was actually their process. So, and you want to interpret the data well, and data without context is, well, kind of useless, because then you're going to make interpretations that are not correct. And I also wanted the team to really own the solution, to come up with the solutions themselves. So this is how far I went, and then gave the team and just asked them questions. So I see 40 hours. Why is this? And then what the big advantage of Disco was, we could look at those cases which were taking really long and then go in a more detailed view and see what's going on. And that's how we found out, for example, that a lot of stuff was being shoved in on a Friday before the ending of the sprint. So then the second team, the green team, which we're working on trip management, it's a bit more, we see a bit more deviations in this process map. So the big problem you see also in the throughput times, and their problem was that it took very long to go from step to step. There weren't a lot of deviations, but it took them 52 hours to go from progress to review, 56 to go to QA, and then again 60 hours to go to story close. So they really had a problem with getting stuff done within a sprint. And the thing with this team was that they were a relatively new team, new developers, new to the company, working on a new project. So what this really shows is that they were going through a learning curve of getting more mature as a scrum team. And that also shows in these figures that it took them 11 working days. We have 10 in one sprint. 0% of the stories followed the ideal development path. And a lot of stories who actually went through that ideal path only were moved to sprint. And then the most interesting team, at least I like to think this is the most interesting one, is the orange team working on a profile. And this team where we had a lot of deviations. So looking at this, what do you think the problem here was? Yeah, Scrum Master, that's mostly always the problem. Coming from a product owner. Anything else? So what you see here is that there are a lot of deviations after something goes into progress. So a lot of work that should be done before it actually goes into progress. At the moment you give something to a development team, you want it to be fully clear, so they just can work on it. And all the questions they could have are answered. And well, what you could see here, if the text was a bit bigger, is that a lot of changes are being applied, a lot of designs are being added, re-estimations of how big or how complex a story is, a lot of changes in descriptions. And the problem this team was having is that there were a lot of changes in the team composition. So a lot of new people, and there was a lot of pressure on it. So what they did, they took in stories into a sprint, which were actually not ready yet. And they said, well, we're agile, so we'll probably figure it out along the way. But in the end, they paid the price because stuff was not clear yet. They had to reanalyze a lot of stuff, and it was slowing them down significantly, which you can see by the thick red lines. And then a comparison, because when we first had the conversation with all the product owners, Scrum Masters, there were like these general comments. Well, we should ban working remotely. We should ban working from home. People are lazy. We should work quicker. We should set milestones and do more micromanagement, for example. And what it shows, these process maps and this comparison, that actually all teams had different problems. So the team below, the yellow team, they were actually the most mature team. Still, if you look at the figures, it isn't all that good. But they were the most mature team of them all. They were working the longest time together and the longest time on one product. And that showed in, well, the best figures out of these teams. Then the orange team, they were paying the price for a lot of changes in the team and pulling stuff into a sprint which wasn't ready. And while the green team, they were just taking much more time to finish stuff and to go from step to step, which showed how, well, immature the team still was. They had a long way to go. So maturity, stability, and preparation matters. And these were the suggestions that we made, actually coming from the teams themselves. So I only showed them the process maps and the figures, and then let them come up with improvements. So we had one big problem with QA overload. So we said, well, we're going to slice stories in smaller subtasks. And the thing with user stories, so with tasks, is you want them to deliver value. But the thing is, if we don't slice them up, they will end up in QA at the end of the sprint. QA won't have enough time. So we slice them up in stories that were small enough to test, so they could test them earlier, and they weren't moved the sprint. The QA overload so the testers were testing on too broadly, too many devices, too many browsers. So we took a data-driven and risk-based approach. So if we only test on the devices and browsers that are actually used by your customers. And for the deviation in the development path that we saw in that last, this one, we basically said, well, if a story is not ready, it's not in. It sounds really logical, but under pressure, a lot of teams are tempted to just pull it in and say, well, we're Agile, we're going to fix it anyway. But we just said, well, if it's not ready, if it's not, it doesn't have like all the checks in the list of stuff that needs to be in there, we're not going to pull it in. So we did, for the one team that was quite new, we didn't do a follow-up because they were just getting up to speed. It didn't really make sense to do a comparison after a while. For the other two teams, we did. So this was the process map that I just showed you for the yellow team, so before. And then in the same amount of sprints, we did a comparison, taking into account the suggestions that we did. And this is how it looks now. Well, I'd like to think that the suggestions that we made had a positive influence on this, but it's kind of tempting to say so. To me, it kind of sounds like this plastic surgery or shampoo ad where you show a horrible before picture and a beautiful after picture and see what my magic potion did. Because we also have to take into account that we're now 14 weeks further. So the team had 14 weeks more to get to know each other, to get to know each other's weaknesses and get more familiar with the product. So yeah, I like to think that based on the process mining exercise that we did and the suggestions, the improvements, we did achieve a better streamlined development, but probably not the only cause. It's not a pure causal relationship. And then for the more interesting process map, so the one with a lot of deviations, it looks now like this. So also now we see much higher rates of stories following the ideal path. Of course, we see some deviations, and you probably always have them. We're still working with humans, so we make mistakes. Sometimes stuff that we estimate, in the end, it tends to be bigger or smaller, or we're working on something and we want to change, we want to react on it. So we take a different approach along the way. Before I move on, so in a lot of cases with process mining, you end up, we saved a lot of money by doing this and this action in the process differently, or we saving time. And then we put targets on it, and we see, now the throughput time is like at X, and after a certain amount of weeks, we want it to be Y. That's something that we consciously stayed away from. We didn't want to put any targets on it, saying to the team, well, the amount of stories that follow the ideal development path should be higher, because then you run the risk that people are actually going to change their behavior to positively influence the metrics, and not so much the work that they do or the product that they do. So what could happen is that developers, if they know they're being monitored and being evaluated based on these process maps and throughput times, they're just going to pass on inferior work to the next step, and then say, well, I did it in less hours. But in the end, it won't matter, because the tester will take more time and ping-pong it back to the developer, because the quality isn't that good. So for me, using process mining in this context was completely new. It was something I didn't even know if it would work out. In the end, I was kind of positive about it. These were the learnings that are the things that I encountered during that process. So getting data out of Jira was pretty easy, either manually or you could talk to the API of Jira, that Jira provides, and get the data via that. Lots of variables available. It also brings a challenge about what you are going to use and not. So for example, what was also included was who made a certain action, who was the developer who put the story to review, or who was the tester who was testing it. And that's something that I also consciously, on purpose, I left out. So I didn't want to had the team to think that we're monitoring them and put pressure on them. And then, again, run the risk that they're going to show behavior, change the behavior, because they know they're being monitored. Well, the visualizations that we got via Disco really helped the people who weren't working with data on a daily basis to really understand what was happening. Also our management. So what we saw, that this one team, this yellow team, they were the most stable team, working together for the longest time, working on one product for the longest time, and had the best figures. So this was also a signal to our management. Well, if you want high efficiency, you should leave our development teams alone. You have to keep them stable. The bad, or the things that were a bit challenging, was deciding on what to keep. So for example, we also had a lot of comments that didn't really provide any value, like, well, the functionality is available in test environment. It was kind of a heads up to our testers. So that was stuff that I cleaned out. Something that I encountered during while looking at the process maps was that on certain dates I encountered a lot of activity. And only by putting it into context, I understood that that was the time that the team was doing their refinement, for example, or was doing their sprint planning. So a lot of changes occurred in those stories. And then really the ugly, the things that I don't have a solution for yet, is dealing with flexible working hours. So we're kind of flexible with the developers. Sometimes they're also working from different time zones, so in Canada or India. And that's kind of difficult when you want, using Disco, you want to only have working hours included, because you can't just do 9 to 5, because some of our developers are in a different time zone working during the night. And lack of timely Jira administration by the Scrum team. So sometimes I found that stories went into progress, and then a minute after they went into review, and a minute after they went into QA. So the developers were just a bit lazy about registering the stuff that they were doing. And well, it messes up your throughput times. And again, there you also see the need that you really have to put the data into context if you want to have something meaningful out of it. Some stuff that I would like to share with you before I leave the floor. Pictures say more than words. I think most of us were used to working with data, but we shouldn't underestimate how hard it is to go through that learning curve if you never work with data. So really keep it simple. Data is really black and white, reality is not. So always put it into context, don't offer solutions. So the only thing I did was mine the data, visualize it, come up with some stuff that I found interesting, and then ask questions to the people who are actually producing the data, and let them be the owners of the solutions and the improvements. And don't just put a target on everything that you can measure. So if we would put targets on throughput times or the rates that stories go via that ideal development path, I'm sure that people are just going to influence change their behavior to influence the metrics and not the product. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Really interesting use case. Let's do 2 quick questions before the break. So I'll make a start again. So you said the process is actually the role of the Scrum Master. So how did they react to your pictures in the end?
Yeah, well, their first reaction was, well, they didn't like it because I was on their terrain. But in the end, it was the Scrum Masters who were asking me, well, we're now 14 weeks later, so 7 iterations later, where are the process maps? So I was also consciously waiting for them. I didn't want to bother them again. Well, here they are. You have to talk to them, to your team. I was really waiting, well, if they're going to approach me naturally. And, well, they did.
Great. Thanks.
A quick question. Here.
Yep. Sorry.
So if you look at Kanban way of looking things, the process steps are kind of straightforward. So what you did is kind of putting all the loop back from the Kanban visually. But would you think that the metrics you have on Kanban could have helped in a similar way that what you have done with process mining? Meaning piling up in QA or stuff like that.
So what kind of metrics are you then referring
like
to?
the number, simply looking at the end of the sprint, the number of tickets that is in QA stage or something like that.
Yeah, that gives you some information of where the bottleneck is. If you have like 1 story that's in progress, 1 in QA, 1 in review, and like 10 in QA, it's kind of obvious where the bottleneck is. But it still doesn't give you enough information to really understand what the problem is. There is a problem, but what is causing it? Then you have to go in deeper detail. And yeah, also the process maps, I don't know, I don't have the exact explanation for it, but my experience is that it helps people better understand the flow than just the process steps in Kanban.
Let's take the remaining questions into the break, and let's thank Marc once more, please.